Hey all, how's it going? Welcome to The Last Hike. In today's episode, I'm covering a hiker who climbed Angel's Landing during extreme summer heat and spent more time worrying about her phone than her own body. After hours of filming in direct sun, she would attempt the most dangerous section with only one hand on the chain, which would leave her hanging over hundreds of feet of open air. It was the 17th of July, 2021. In the middle of summer, the sandstone canyons of Zion National Park become heat traps. The towering canyon walls hold the heat in, while the rock radiates it back from below. By 8 that morning, temperatures near the trailhead were already around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Within a few hours, they would climb past 100, and conditions on the exposed ridgelines felt even hotter. One of Zion's most famous hikes is Angel's Landing, a narrow sandstone ridge with drops of more than 1,000 feet on either side. The final section requires hikers to use chains bolted into the rock as they climb toward the summit. It is a demanding trail that requires preparation and fitness, but that summer, the park was busier than ever. It was the first major travel season after the lockdowns, and visitors flooded into national parks across the country. Angel's Landing had no permit system at the time, meaning anyone could attempt the hike. On July 17th, thousands of people were already making their way up the trail despite the extreme heat. Piper Weston was 27 years old and lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. She worked a part-time remote marketing job and spent the rest of her time building travel and outdoor content. By the summer of 2021, she had been doing it for about a year and a half and was getting good at it. She had a good eye, good instincts, and came across naturally on camera. Over the previous 18 months, most of her hiking experience had come on easier trails, well-marked routes around Sedona, mostly flat terrain, and a loop through Bryce Canyon that she had posted online and that had performed well. She knew how to spend time outdoors. She knew how to tell the story of a place. What she lacked was technical experience. Scrambling was new to her, so were fixed chains. She had never been on a trail where a mistake could send someone hundreds of feet down a cliff face.
Yeah, that right there is a pretty common story. People getting comfortable on familiar trails, then signing up for something a little bigger without realizing how different the skills can be.
A trip to Zion 2 years earlier had left her with good memories. That visit had been limited to an easy trail along the canyon floor, and nothing about it had felt especially difficult. Angel's Landing had been sitting on her content calendar since early June. The route was saved on her phone the night before, a room had been booked at a motel outside the park, and the next morning she drove out to the trailhead. Piper started the hike at 8:45 in the morning from the main trailhead. Most hikers complete Angel's Landing in roughly 4 to 5 hours round trip. Piper's repeated filming stops meant she was already moving more slowly than the average pace from the beginning. That start time matters. The recommended start time for Angel's Landing in July is before 6 a.m., early enough to be off the exposed upper section before the heat peaks. At 8:45, Piper would be hitting the most dangerous part of the trail right around the time the temperature hit its highest point of the day. She was already behind before she took a single step.
By itself, an 8:45 start is not a disaster. The problem was that the hardest and most exposed sections of Angel's Landing were still ahead of her, and the temperatures were only going in one direction.
She was carrying two 32-ounce water bottles, 64 ounces total. And I want to be fair here because that is not nothing. That sounds like a responsible amount of water. The problem is that in that heat, with that level of exertion, the recommended intake is closer to half a liter every 30 minutes of activity. Against that standard, 64 ounces runs out fast. And Piper was not going to be moving at a normal pace. Take a look at what she was carrying and you will understand why. A small tan canvas sling bag hung from one shoulder, with no hip strap and no chest strap to keep it stable. She was wearing a sage green matching set, biker shorts and a cropped long sleeve, along with a white baseball cap that covered the top of her head but left her neck, ears, and most of her face exposed to the sun. On her feet were lightweight trail runners with minimal tread, the kind that photograph well but do not offer much grip on polished sandstone. The bag held a Sony ZV-1 compact camera, a Joby GorillaPod, a DJI OM4 phone gimbal clipped to the outside, an iPhone 12 Pro, an Anker power bank, a second outfit rolled into a Ziploc bag, and 2 protein bars. It was more weight than it looked like, all carried on a single shoulder.
If I showed you that packing list without telling you where she was going, would your first guess be Angel's Landing? Probably not. It looked more like someone preparing to film than someone preparing to hike.
The first stretch of trail runs through the canyon and it is shaded and genuinely beautiful. Cool air, red rock walls on either side, the kind of scenery that photographs itself. Piper was moving slowly from the start, stopping every few minutes to set up the GorillaPod on rocks along the trail, filming walking clips, doing short talking segments to camera. Each stop was 5 to 10 minutes of standing still, reviewing the footage, adjusting the angle, going again. The canyon section felt easy. It was supposed to feel easy. That is the thing about this trail. It lulls you. By the time the trail opened up onto Walter's Wiggles, the shade was gone. Walter's Wiggles is a series of 21 steep switchbacks cut directly into the sandstone cliff face, and they are completely open to the sky. No trees, no overhangs, nothing between you and the sun. The sandstone on either side reflects heat back at you from multiple directions at once, and the air stops moving. Piper stopped 3 times on the switchbacks to film, setting up the GorillaPod on flat rocks, stepping back to frame herself against the canyon dropping away behind her. Each stop was another 5 to 10 minutes of standing still in full sun. She was drinking from her first bottle between stops, but in sips, not in the volumes her body actually needed.
One of the reasons desert heat catches people off guard is that it rarely feels dramatic. There's no sudden moment where the temperature announces itself, it just keeps taking a little more out of you.
She finished her first bottle somewhere in the upper section of Walter's Wiggles. She had been on the trail for just under 2 hours. She was down to 32 ounces for everything that came next. By the time she reached the flat open area at the base of the chain section, she had a headache. Not a bad one, the kind that sits behind the eyes and is easy to explain away. She sat down on a rock, ate half of one of her protein bars, took a few sips from her second bottle, checked her camera footage, and adjusted her cap. She stayed there for about 15 minutes. Scout Lookout is where a lot of hikers stop and reassess. It is the last wide, relatively forgiving area before the chains begin. For some people, it is also where the hike ends. The view is already spectacular, and the exposed ridge ahead is enough to convince them they have gone far enough.
I've always thought that turning around is one of the most underrated skills in the outdoors, and sometimes the smartest decision a person can actually make all day. Whether Piper would see it that way, we'll soon find out.
A small group of hikers nearby were doing exactly that. Visibly tired, a couple sat with their heads down while another poured water over the back of his neck. Piper watched them for a moment. Then she looked up at the chains, stood, and kept going. And this is where the trail changes completely. The chain section is not a trail anymore. It is a near vertical scramble up a narrow sandstone spine with fixed chains bolted into the rock at intervals. The path is 2 to 4 feet wide in places. On either side of that path, there is nothing. Open air and a very long way down. On a Saturday in peak summer, it is also crowded. Hikers moving in both directions, groups bunching up at the narrower sections, people waiting on wider ledges for gaps to open up before they can move. It is loud, it is slow, and it demands your full attention. Piper joined the flow moving upward and almost immediately fell behind the pace of the people around her. She was moving with one hand on the chain and her phone in the other, filming as she climbed, talking quietly to the camera about the view, the chains, how different it felt from anything she had done before. Other hikers passed her or waited behind her while she stopped to adjust her phone angle, then moved around her when a wider section opened up. Nobody said anything. Everyone was focused on their own footing. She stopped twice on the lower portion of the chain section to set up the GorillaPod on wider flat ledges, stepping back to get herself and the drop in the same frame. Each setup took several minutes. Each one was more time standing still on open rock in full sun. By this point, she had been outside in the heat for well over 2 hours, and her body had been working hard the entire time. About halfway up the chain section, she sat down on a narrow ledge and pulled out her phone to check the footage. The screen was slow to respond. Then it went black and threw up the temperature warning. The thermometer icon that locks the device and disables everything except emergency calls. The phone had overheated. Phones shut themselves down when internal temperatures reach levels that can damage the battery or processor. They are designed to protect themselves. Human bodies do not work that way. A person can keep walking, climbing, talking, and making decisions long after dangerous heat stress has already started affecting judgment and coordination. She put it face down on the rock in the shadow of her bag. She fanned it with her cap. Then she pulled the spare outfit out of the Ziploc bag and draped it loosely over the phone to block the sun. And then she just waited, checking every few minutes by lifting the corner of the fabric. It lasted somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes.
Hours into the hike and already dealing with a headache, yet the thing she was focused on was her phone? You could argue she had bigger things to worry about.
She sat on an exposed ledge with the rock beneath her well over 100 degrees. No shade, no breeze. Just heat radiating up from the sandstone and the sun beating down from above. By that point, she had already spent more than 2 hours in those conditions, burning through water faster than she was replacing it. Now, she was adding another 15 to 20 minutes to the total. The problem with heat is that there is rarely a clear moment when a person realizes they have crossed a line. Heat exhaustion is the warning stage. Weakness, dizziness, nausea, nausea, heavy sweating. The body is struggling, but it is still sending signals that something is wrong. Most people who reach that point feel bad enough to slow down or stop. Heat stroke is different. It is what happens when those warnings go ignored or unnoticed. Core temperature climbs above 103, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the brain starts to malfunction. Judgment is usually one of the first things to go, then coordination. Eventually, even the ability to recognize that anything is wrong.
If you're sitting there thinking, I would know when it was time to stop, I wouldn't be so sure about that, sir. Heat has fooled a lot of people before.
Part of the reason is that people do not always feel as bad as you would expect. In the early stages, some feel surprisingly normal. Some feel loose, relaxed, even confident. Meanwhile, the body is moving in the opposite direction. On an exposed ridgeline in full sun, with sandstone reflecting heat from below and little air moving through, that transition can happen faster than most people realize. The desert makes it even harder to recognize because sweat evaporates almost as soon as it appears. There is no dramatic moment, no obvious warning that the line has been crossed. A person can keep moving, keep talking, keep making decisions, all while their condition is getting worse. By the time her phone recovered and she stood back up, Piper had already spent well over 2 hours exposed to those conditions, much of it in direct sunlight. Her phone recovered, she packed it back up and kept climbing. She was stopping more often now. Sometimes she would pause for a few seconds before moving again, as if mentally resetting before the next section of chain. Her legs were heavier than they had been on Walter's Wiggles. The climb was slower too. She was taking longer between movements, gripping the chain, pausing, then continuing. She was still drinking from her second bottle, but only in small sips, stretching it out. The headache that had started at the flat area below the chains was still there. It was not getting any better. Other hikers on the chain section were moving with both hands on the chain, focused and deliberate. Piper was moving with one hand most of the time, the other holding her phone or reaching for her bag. At one point, a hiker coming down paused on a wider section and waited for her to pass, watching her navigate a narrow stretch one-handed before continuing down. When she pulled herself up onto the broader area near the top, she sat down almost immediately. Her phone was at 17%. She plugged in the power bank, set the phone on top of her bag, and waited for it to charge. Another 10 to 15 minutes of sitting still in full sun at the highest and most exposed point of the entire hike.
I asked earlier whether Piper would know whether she had gone far enough. By this point, I'm not particularly optimistic.
It was somewhere around 11:30 in the morning. The temperature on that ridgeline was at its peak. There is a tendency to think of summits as finish lines. In reality, they are often just the halfway point. The mountain does not particularly care whether you are going up or coming down. The same exposure, the same heat, and the same consequences are still waiting on the descent. Many experienced hikers were already on their way back down by that point. The standard strategy for Angel's Landing in midsummer is simple. Start before sunrise, reach the summit early, and descend before the worst heat arrives. Piper was only just reaching the summit. She started filming when the battery hit 30%. She pulled the Sony out of her bag and moved around the upper area, finding angles, set up the GorillaPod on a flat rock for a wide shot with the canyon dropping away behind her. She knocked it over once setting it up. She reached for the Sony and misjudged the distance to her bag, knocking it sideways before catching it. She laughed it off, reset, kept filming. She switched between the Sony and her phone for different shots and filmed for about 25 minutes. She was present. She was talking. She looked like someone having the time of her life, but the small errors were there. The knocked tripod, the misjudged reach, the slightly imprecise movements that had not been there in the canyon footage from 2 hours earlier. If you watched the summit footage without knowing what came next, you would probably not notice. But if you watched it back to back with the canyon footage from the start of the hike, the difference was there. Then she packed the Sony back into her bag, made sure the gimbal was folded and clipped to the outside, took a sip from her second bottle, and started down. The descent on the chain section is harder than the climb up. Going down means facing outward or sideways, watching your footing on a downward slope, and controlling your speed on the chain. Your grip matters more. Your focus matters more. Your legs are already tired, and the exposure feels different when you're looking out at it instead of up at it. More immediate, more real. Piper was moving slowly on the way down. She had her phone out, filming loosely, not really framing anything, just letting it run. The headache was still there, and so was the fatigue. There was a kind of carefulness to how she moved now, the kind that shows up when even simple movements start taking more effort than they should.
This should have been the easy part. Not easy exactly, but easier. The summit was behind her, and with every step, she was getting closer to the trailhead.
About 5 minutes into the descent, her right foot slipped on a smooth, pale section of rock. The sole scraped across the surface, and her body dropped slightly before her left hand tightened on the chain and caught her. She stopped for a moment, shifted her weight back toward the chain, and kept going. 3 or 4 minutes later, it happened again. Her right foot slipped on a downward angled section, her knee dropping toward the rock before she caught herself with both hands on the chain. She stayed there for a moment, weight low and gripping tightly, before straightening up and continuing. A hiker, a short distance below, glanced back at her and then turned away. She had now slipped twice in less than 5 minutes. Neither incident ended badly, which made them easy to treat as isolated mistakes rather than part of a larger problem.
By now, Piper had proof that she could recover from a slip. What she didn't have was any guarantee that she could do it every time.
Her grip on the chain had been changing over the last hour in a way that is difficult to track from the outside and nearly impossible to track from the inside. The repeated gripping and releasing on hot metal, the dry skin, the gradual degradation of fine motor coordination that comes with a core temperature pushing past 103 degrees, her hand was on the chain, but the strength behind it was not what it had been 2 hours earlier. The gimbal clipped to the outside of her bag had been bumping against the chain links for several minutes on the descent. Every few steps, it tapped lightly against the metal. At one point, it caught. The folded clip snagged on a chain link and pulled her bag sideways, slipping it slightly off her shoulder. It was not a major problem. It was not an emergency. It was the kind of small annoyance that happens on trails every day. Piper reached back with her right hand to free it. Her left hand was still on the chain. Her right foot was planted on a section of sandstone that angled slightly outward and downward. Pale, almost white in the sun, polished smooth by years of foot traffic, the same surface her foot had already slipped on twice during the descent. When she reached back toward the bag, her weight shifted to the right. Her right foot slid several inches across the sandstone. Instinctively, her body tried to correct. Her left knee buckled. The chain moved slightly away from her as she leaned into it instead of tightening her grip around it. She tried to recover her balance, but the movement carried her too far. She went over the edge. Her left hip struck the lip of the rock shelf she had been standing on. The impact spun her sideways as she fell. Roughly 15 feet below, she hit a lower ledge with her right shoulder and the right side of her head. That impact redirected the fall into a tumble. She rolled and slid across a steep section of sandstone, catching briefly on small outcroppings before breaking free again and continuing downward. Then she reached the larger drop. The second fall was somewhere between 180 and 200 feet. She came to rest against a rock formation at the base of the southeast face, partially on a narrow ledge and partially against a vertical wall. She did not move. A hiker about 25 feet above her on the chain section glanced over only after hearing a scrape and a heavy impact. By the time he looked toward the section of trail where Piper had been, she was gone. Finding a stable position on the chain section took time. The terrain was too exposed to simply let go and reach for a phone. Nearly a minute passed before he found enough footing to free both hands and make a call. He dialed emergency services as soon as he could. The information he was able to give was limited to a general location on the southeast face. The spot where Piper had come to rest was out of view. The terrain beneath that section of Angel's Landing is not accessible without technical equipment. A ground team could not simply hike down to her location. Rescue personnel were dispatched, but the canyon created its own problems. Narrow walls, shifting wind patterns, and limited visibility complicated the helicopter approach. It took multiple passes before the crew could visually locate her from the air. Once they did, a technical rescue team rappelled down from above. Approaching from below was not possible. More than 2 hours passed between the fall and the moment responders were finally able to reach her. Her body was recovered from the southeast face the same afternoon. Her sling bag was still on her shoulder. The power bank was still plugged into her phone. The cable pulled taut and partially disconnected from the impact, consistent with the bag being wrenched during the fall sequence. The phone screen was cracked across the lower half, but the device powered on. It contained 43 videos and over 230 photos taken that morning. The last video was recorded approximately 80 seconds before the fall. In the final frames, she is reaching back toward the outside of her bag. The audio cuts mid-movement. The Sony ZV-1 was recovered from inside the bag, the body cracked along the top corner but the memory card intact. The GorillaPod was found approximately 30 feet from where she came to rest, separated from the bag during the fall. Her second water bottle was recovered from her bag with roughly 4 ounces remaining. The coroner listed the cause of death as catastrophic blunt force polytrauma, consistent with a multi-stage fall from significant elevation. The injuries reflected the sequence of the fall rather than a single impact. The initial contact with the rock shelf fractured her left hip. The ledge she struck roughly 15 feet below caused severe injuries to her right shoulder and the right side of her head. The slide down the rock face left extensive lacerations across much of her body. The final drop caused catastrophic trauma to her chest and skull, along with severe internal bleeding. When investigators reconstructed the fall, the physical evidence on the southeast face matched both the injury pattern and the witness account. Each major injury corresponded to a different stage of the descent. The report also listed severe dehydration and early-stage heat stroke as contributing factors. Based on the environmental conditions and the reconstructed timeline, her core temperature at the time of the fall was estimated to be between 103 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, reduced grip strength, slower reaction times, and impaired motor coordination are not unusual findings. Looking back through the timeline, the pattern is difficult to ignore. The repeated stops in full sun, the headache, the slowing pace on the chains, the 2 slips in the minutes before the fatal one, the time spent waiting for her phone to cool, the extra time spent charging it near the summit, none of those details caused the fall by themselves. Together, however, they help explain how Piper arrived at that section of trail with a body that had already been pushed well beyond what it could comfortably handle. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The case was closed less than 2 months later.
The reason Piper's story resonates beyond the hiking world is that the behavior itself is familiar. Most people know what it's like to tell themselves just a little farther.